The moment Karen dialed 911, she thought she was in control. She thought she was protecting her neighborhood. She thought she was about to teach a lesson to the black man she deemed suspicious. But what she didn't know was that the man she was trying to destroy already had the truth in his hands. Her truth. By the time the sirens wailed down her street, it wasn't Jamal who was in danger. It was her. Jamal Williams pulled into the long driveway of the suburban home, double-checking the address on his phone. This was the right place. He had spent weeks searching for the perfect golden retriever puppy, scrolling through endless listings, reading reviews, and ensuring he was dealing with a reputable breeder. Losing his childhood dog, Max, had left a hole in his heart, and now that he was finally in a stable place in life, he was ready to open his home to a new furry companion. Excitement filled his chest as he turned off the engine and stepped out of his car. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that made you feel like an intruder, even when you had every right to be there. Rows of neatly trimmed hedges lined the driveways, and the houses looked almost identical, large, pristine, and undoubtedly expensive. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him. It wasn't new. Jamal had grown up understanding that certain neighborhoods came with unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't. But today, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was here for his new best friend. Across the street, Karen stood on her porch, gripping her coffee cup so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 15 years, and she prided herself on knowing everyone who came and went. So when she spotted a tall black man stepping out of a car she didn't recognize, her heart started to race. She didn't know who he was, but she didn't like the way he was looking around, checking his phone, then glancing at the house in front of him. To her, it looked like he was scoping the place out. The fact that it was broad daylight didn't matter. She had seen enough news stories to know that crime didn't wait for the cover of darkness anymore. Jamal took a deep breath and walked toward the front door, but before he could even ring the doorbell, he heard the faint click of a camera. He turned slightly and noticed Karen, phone in hand, taking pictures of him from across the street. His stomach clenched. Here we go. He had dealt with this kind of thing before, the suspicious glances, the whispered conversations, the people clutching their purses a little tighter when he walked past them in stores. But something about this woman's expression put him on edge. She wasn't just suspicious, she was convinced he was up to something. Karen lowered her phone and immediately dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person in my neighborhood," she said quickly, her voice laced with urgency. "He's just standing outside a house, looking around like he's about to break in." The dispatcher on the other end asked her to describe the person. "He's a black man, tall, wearing a dark hoodie," she said, conveniently leaving out the fact that he was also well-dressed in jeans and a clean button-down shirt. "I don't know if he has a weapon, but he looks dangerous. Please send someone quickly." Jamal knocked on the door, unaware of the storm brewing just a few houses away. Inside, the breeder was grabbing the puppy, ready to introduce Jamal to his new best friend. But outside, Karen stood on her porch, watching with narrowed eyes, waiting for the police to arrive. The warm afternoon sun bathed the quiet suburban street in a golden glow, but for Karen, the sight of Jamal standing at that doorstep cast a long shadow of suspicion. She paced her porch, her phone still clutched in her hand after calling 911. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from a strange sense of duty, like she had to protect her neighborhood from what she imagined was a lurking danger. Across the street, Jamal knocked on the door again, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He could hear barking inside, followed by footsteps. His excitement returned as he anticipated meeting the breeder and finally seeing the puppy in person. The thought of bringing the little golden retriever home made him grin. Behind him, the sound of tires crunching against the pavement made him glance over his shoulder. A black and white police cruiser turned onto the street, moving slowly. His stomach tightened. He knew that look. That slow, deliberate roll meant only one thing. Someone had called them. His jaw clenched as he exhaled sharply. Not again. The police car pulled up to the curb and two officers stepped out, One rested a hand on his belt near his holstered weapon, while the other approached with a careful, practiced expression. Jamal took a deep breath, keeping his hands visible. He had been through this before, and he knew how it played out. "Sir," the first officer called out. "Can we talk to you for a second?" Jamal turned fully toward them, already feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could see Karen standing on her porch, arms folded, watching closely. "Sure, officers," he said, keeping his voice even. "What's the problem?" "We got a call about a suspicious person in the area," the second officer said, eyeing him. Jamal let out a humorless chuckle. "Let me guess," he said, nodding toward Karen's house. "From her?" The officers didn't answer, but their silence spoke volumes. "I'm here to pick up a puppy," he explained, gesturing toward the house behind him. "I spoke to the breeder earlier today. I can show you the messages." One of the officers nodded, but still looked wary. "Do you have an ID on you?" Jamal knew the routine. He reached slowly into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, watching as the officer studied it. Behind them, the front door finally opened and an older white man stepped out. The breeder, Mr. Reynolds, took one look at the situation and frowned. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. "We received a call about a suspicious individual," one officer said, still holding Jamal's ID. Reynolds' expression darkened. "Suspicious?" He turned to Jamal. "You're Jamal, right?" "Yes, sir." The breeder let out an exasperated sigh. "This man is my customer. He's here to buy a puppy." For a moment, the officers seemed unsure of what to do. They exchanged glances, then finally returned Jamal's ID. "Sorry about the mix-up," one of them said stiffly. Jamal took his ID back and shook his head, the anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. The officers turned away, heading back toward their cruiser, while Karen remained on her porch, eyes wide, realizing her mistake. But she had no idea that this was only the beginning. Mr. Reynolds stood on his front porch, his lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line as he watched the police officers walk back to their cruiser. His gaze flicked toward Karen, who was still standing on her porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She wasn't looking at them anymore. Her eyes were downcast, her expression unreadable. Jamal let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm, though frustration churned in his chest. He had been here for all of 5 minutes, and already he had been treated like a criminal. He was tired of it, tired of always having to prove that he wasn't a threat, tired of people like Karen who jumped to conclusions the moment they saw him. Reynolds shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." Then he turned to Jamal, his expression softening. "Come on in, son. Let's get you that puppy." Jamal nodded, forcing a smile as he stepped inside. The tension from the encounter still clung to him, but as soon as he entered the house, he was greeted by the sound of tiny paws skittering across the hardwood floor. A small, golden-furred puppy bounded toward him, tail wagging furiously. Jamal knelt, a genuine smile breaking across his face as the puppy jumped onto his lap, licking his hands and face with enthusiasm. "There you go," Reynolds said, his voice warming. "That's your boy right there." Jamal scooped the puppy into his arms, feeling a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. He had wanted this moment for weeks, but now, with everything that had just happened outside, it felt even more significant. This wasn't just about getting a dog. It was about proving that he belonged, that he had every right to be here, no matter what Karen thought. As he stood up, cradling the puppy, he glanced out the window. Karen was still outside, pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. Jamal frowned. He had half a mind to go out there and confront her, but what would be the point? People like her never admitted they were wrong. Instead, he turned back to Reynolds. "Thanks for this," he said, nodding toward the puppy. Reynolds patted him on the shoulder. "You're welcome. And listen, I'm real sorry about what just happened. That woman has always been nosy, but this was too much." Jamal shrugged, adjusting the puppy in his arms. "I'm used to it." Reynolds shook his head. "You shouldn't have to be." Jamal appreciated the sentiment, but he had long ago accepted that this was the world he lived in. He pulled out his phone to complete the payment, but as he did, a notification popped up, an email from an unknown sender. He frowned, clicking on it out of curiosity. The subject line read, "You need to know the truth about Karen." His heartbeat quickened as he scanned the message. What he read made his stomach drop. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor with a bad habit of calling the cops on black men. She had a secret, a dark one, and now Jamal knew exactly what it was. Jamal's grip on his phone tightened as he reread the email, his pulse pounding in his ears. The message was brief, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. You need to know the truth about Karen. She's not who she pretends to be. Check the attached files. There was an attachment, several in fact. His finger hovered over the first one, hesitation creeping in. Who had sent this? And why? Was this some kind of joke? Everything all right? Reynolds asked, noticing the shift in Jamal's expression. Jamal blinked, shaking himself out of his thoughts. Yeah, just got a weird email. Reynolds frowned. Anything important? Jamal wasn't sure yet. He glanced down at the puppy in arms, who was squirming and licking his fingers, blissfully unaware of the tension in the air. Taking a deep breath, he decided now wasn't the time to get distracted. He had come here for one reason, to bring home his new companion. Nothing urgent, he finally said. Let's finish up the paperwork. A few minutes later, Jamal walked back to his car, the puppy curled up inside a small carrier on the passenger seat. He couldn't help but glance toward Karen's house. She was still outside, but now she was on the phone, pacing anxiously. Maybe she was calling a friend, spinning a different version of what had just happened, one where she was the victim, just a concerned neighbor looking out for her community. Jamal scoffed and slid into the driver's seat. He had every intention of driving home and leaving this day behind him, but the email gnawed at him. Something about it didn't sit right. As he sat in his car, he tapped the first attachment. A PDF opened on his screen, filled with scanned documents. His eyes skimmed over the first few lines, and suddenly everything around him blurred into the background. Karen was hiding something big. The documents contained legal records, sealed court files, old police reports, and even newspaper clippings. At first, it was hard to piece together, but then the pieces started falling into place. Years ago, Karen had been involved in a criminal case. Not just involved, she had been the suspect in a fraud scheme. According to the documents, she had been accused of embezzling thousands of dollars from a charity organization she worked for. The case had made local headlines at the time, but for some reason the charges had been mysteriously dropped. Jamal's breath hitched. She had gotten away with it. There was more. Another attachment revealed an old police report, one that accused Karen of filing false reports against people of color in her neighborhood. One of those reports had led to the wrongful arrest of a young black teenager who had simply been walking home from school. The charges against him were later dismissed, but not before he had spent a night in jail. Jamal exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor with a habit of calling the police. She was dangerous. And now she had just tried to do the same thing to him. Who had sent this to him? And why now? His eyes flicked toward her house one last time, his mind now filled with more questions than answers. One thing was clear. He wasn't letting this go. Jamal's hands trembled slightly as he locked his phone screen and stared ahead. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the revelation. Karen had spent years weaponizing the system against people like him, and she had almost gotten away with it again. But this time, fate had other plans. He turned to look at Karen's house. She was still on the phone, her voice sharp, her pacing frantic. He could only guess what she was saying, maybe venting about how dangerous he looked or doubling down on her lies. But now he had something she didn't expect. The truth. Truth. Jamal took a deep breath and clicked on the next attachment in the email. His eyes widened. It was a scanned letter, an anonymous tip sent to a journalist years ago, detailing how Karen had bribed someone to make her fraud charges disappear. But the story had never been published. Maybe it had been buried, maybe the journalist had been threatened, or maybe it had just been lost in the shuffle. But now it was in Jamal's hands, and he wasn't about to let it die. With a steady resolve, he copied the files and sent them out. First, to a well-known investigative journalist he followed on social media. Then, to a few online activism pages that specialized in exposing corruption. Finally, to the local news station. He didn't know which one would take the bait first, but he knew one thing. Karen's past was about to catch up with her. As he pressed send, a weight lifted from his chest. The puppy stirred beside him, letting out a tiny yawn. Jamal reached over, rubbing the pup's soft ears. "Don't worry, buddy. We're heading home soon. Just then, a notification popped up on his phone. Pah! New message from unknown sender. He hesitated before opening it. Good move. Now watch what happens next. A shiver ran down his spine. Whoever had sent this information clearly knew a lot more than they were letting on. But before he could respond, another sound caught his attention. Karen's voice, suddenly rising in panic. He turned his head just in time to see her staring at her phone, her face drained of color. She clutched it tightly, scrolling frantically. And then she looked straight at him. Jamal smirked. The news had started spreading. She stumbled back a step, gripping the railing of her porch as if the weight of her own secrets was finally crashing down on her. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. It was the face of someone realizing they had just lost everything. Jamal didn't need to say a word. He simply started his car, rolled down the window, and gave her one final glance. Looks like the truth finally caught up with you, he said smoothly. Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She knew it was over. As Jamal drove off, he felt lighter. He had come here for a puppy, but had left with something far greater: justice.